To a lot of people, turn-based gameplay is boring and outdated. As technology and game design has advanced, we've reached a point where turn-based combat systems simply aren't needed. And this is a shame, because there are a lot of fantastic turn-based games, many of which just simply would not work as well as they do without their turn-based combat. In this video, I want to defend turn-based RPGs. If you don't already love the genre, then I probably won't be able to do much to change that, as our opinions are subjective, and each of us finds different styles of gameplay appealing. While I might not be able to convince you to love turn-based games, I want to try and communicate their strengths and explain why these systems appeal to so many people. But before we begin, we have to define what a turn-based RPG is, at least for the purposes of this video. There are a lot of different types of RPGs, and most of them have at least a few games that are turn-based. To keep things simple, I'm going to be focusing primarily on turn-based jrpgs. Many of the points I have here will still apply to other types of RPGs, including turn-based tactical and western RPGs, but I'm less familiar with these genres and I don't want to make any claims that aren't accurate. Outside of this though, I'm going to be fairly loose on my definition of turn-based. Games with more dynamic turn systems such as the Grandia series, and games that don't fully pause time during their turns such as the active time battle system in classic Final Fantasy games will be allowed. You should note that specific strengths and weaknesses of these systems may differ when compared to more traditional turn-based systems, but most of these points should still apply. One important difference between turn-based and non-turn-based games is how they test the player. Typically, action-focused games tend to primarily test the player's mechanical ability. While their strategy might be a factor, the player's understanding of the game mechanics and ability to execute certain actions is the primary test of these systems. Oftentimes, if a player is good enough, they can get through fights without getting hit by a single enemy or draining too many resources. By contrast, turn-based games test the player's strategy. Enemies will inevitably be able to act, which makes damage inevitable. Instead, turn-based games become a test of optimization. Finding the most efficient way to take out a group of enemies can be quite challenging, testing the player's full understanding of the game mechanics. I think that the reason turn-based games are so divisive is because of this difference. Compared to most games, turn-based games primarily test a different skill in the player. Additionally, many older games and early parts of many turn-based games tend to be fairly simple, which can give off the impression that combat is nothing more than button mashing through menus. Obviously, this isn't true of every game in the genre, and I'd like to go through some examples of unique turn-based combat systems that would not work as well as they do without turn-based combat. The first game that I would like to talk about is Grandia II, although most of what I have to say also applies to other Grandia games. Grandia II's combat is centered around the initiative bar. Each party member and enemy moves from left to right on the bar. When they reach the command portion in the bar, their turn begins and they get to select their action. Once the character reaches the action position, they will use whatever command was selected. How long this takes varies depending on the character's stats and the type of attack selected. What makes the system so addicting is the cancel and counter system. Certain attacks can cancel enemy actions, which significantly delays their turn as long as they hit an enemy who is between the command and action portions of their bar. Other attacks can counter enemy attacks by hitting them during their attack animation. This forces you to consider the positions of each enemy on the bar whenever you attack, which makes combat significantly more engaging. Different attacks take different amounts of time to use, which can encourage the player to use a weaker move that will take a shorter amount of time to use in order to cancel an enemy's attack. A system like this only works when the player's actions are restricted, and Grandia II's combat remains fun and engaging to this day. The second game that I would like to talk about is Trails in the Sky, although just like Grandia, the rest of the Trails series also shares a similar combat system. Trails combat has a lot of different mechanics, but I want to focus on the turn order. The Trails series uses the action time battle system, in which the order of players and enemies is constantly shifting, shown on the left side of the screen. There are also turn bonuses, known as AT bonuses, which give various bonuses such as critical hits or the ability to instantly kill an opponent, which can be used by both the party and their enemies. While the turn order is constantly shifting, these bonuses are not, and players who want to take full advantage of them will need to adjust their position in combat. There are several ways of doing this. Arts, the game's equivalent of magic, each have their own casting time. Additionally, players have access to special abilities known as S-crafts, which are character-specific abilities. Characters can assign one S-craft as an S-break, allowing them to activate it at any time regardless of turn order. This is a super easy way to directly manipulate the turn order, but it drains a character's craft points, which prevents them from using other crafts. This system forces you to constantly think about the turn order, lining up powerful attacks with critical hits in order to maximize your damage, as well as preventing enemies from doing the same. Dynamic turn systems seen in games like Trails and Grandia can be extremely effective, provided that the turn order is shown to the players so they can plan ahead. The final game that I want to talk about is Bravely Default. Bravely Default's combat is extremely complex, and while I'd like to talk about just how great its job system is, instead I'm going to focus on the titular Brave and Default system. Essentially, characters act by using Brave Points. They gain 1 Brave Point each time their turn begins, and can default, or defend, to gain an additional Brave Point. By braving, a character can use multiple actions in one turn. Characters can use up to 4 actions in one turn, and Brave Points can go into the negatives, allowing characters to brave without wasting turns defaulting. This leaves them useless for a couple of turns while their BP recovers, however, which can be a very risky option. Enemies can also brave in default, and taking full advantage of this system is essential to getting the most out of combat. This system allows your party to be extremely versatile, letting you fulfill multiple roles in one turn, or letting a healer fix up the entire party in an emergency at the risk of being useless for a couple of turns. All of these systems take full advantage of turn-based combat, designing unique mechanics that would not work in action RPGs. But of course, not every game has these mechanics. Many games use more traditional approaches to combat, and I'm not here to tell you that the combat in Final Fantasy IX or Dragon Quest XI is invalid and outdated just because they don't have the specific mechanics that would only work in a turn-based game. There are plenty of other advantages to turn-based games when compared to their live-action counterparts. Firstly, out-of-battle preparation becomes more important. Because enemy turns are inevitable, players will need to upgrade their skills and equipment in order to survive fights. While this might not appeal to everyone, finding and buying new equipment can feel substantially more rewarding as you immediately see the effect it has on your combat capabilities. Final Fantasy IX is a great example of this, as it ties character abilities to equipment, forcing you to decide between equipment containing more powerful abilities and equipment that has higher stats. While a system like this could be done in an action RPG, the fact that you can avoid getting hit means that a system like this is almost always less interesting, as a skilled player is almost always going to prioritize equipment with better abilities. Speaking of abilities, players will most likely have access to more of them. In an action game, having access to a wide range of abilities can feel overwhelming. Most games have to design themselves to work well with a controller, and while MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV can get away with mapping a large number of abilities to a controller, most games just simply won't be able to. Remembering which buttons are mapped to which abilities and executing them in a real-time setup can feel overwhelming, so most action RPGs tend to focus on a smaller but more refined moveset. This usually means that some more creative abilities are left behind in favor of a more streamlined moveset. Even action RPGs with menu systems, like Kingdom Hearts, typically give the player access to less abilities. Depending on your playstyle, having less abilities might be a positive change, but personally I've found that it tends to make combat feel more repetitive. Another advantage of turn-based combat is party members. Handling party members in an action RPG can be extremely difficult. In most action RPGs, you can't control multiple party members at the same time. Because of this, party members you aren't controlling are controlled by the game's AI. These characters are usually substantially less effective, relying on only the most basic of strategies. This can make more complex characters, such as Melee in Xenoblade Chronicles, effectively useless when you aren't controlling them. Of course, many games allow you to switch party members in the middle of combat. However, this has its own disadvantages. Games usually don't pause themselves when you're switching, and it can take a second to adjust to a new moveset, location on the battlefield, and playstyle. This can be disorienting and hurt the gameplay flow for more inexperienced players. Speaking of inexperienced players, turn-based combat tends to be more accessible. This is because turn-based games rarely expect much from the player's mechanical skill outside of their ability to scroll through a menu and select the right options. For newer or disabled players, it might be easier to learn a turn-based system in comparison to an action RPG. This isn't to say that there aren't accessible action RPGs, but rather that turn-based games, as a product of their design, tend to be easier to approach. Of course, some turn-based games are simpler than others, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend giving a game like Shin Megami Tensei III Nocturne to someone inexperienced at RPGs. But there are always games like Paper Mario that keep things simple and easy to understand, staying engaging while asking little of the player in regards to raw mechanical skill. While turn-based games certainly aren't for everyone, they have a dedicated audience. By primarily testing the player's strategy as opposed to their mechanical skill, these combat systems can provide a unique challenge not seen in other games. When compared to their action counterparts, turn-based games oftentimes make better use of skills, equipment, and party members, and their simple design can make them more accessible for newer players. Turn-based combat remains a valid and interesting system, one that will only continue to be refined and developed over time.